Before we start exciting stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and share it with your friends. Also, please, can you tell me where and what time you are watching? The Haunting of Blackthorn Manor. The night was restless, as if the world itself held its breath in anticipation. The wind howled through the dense forest surrounding the small, desolate village of Ravenswood. Shadows danced in the flickering light of the moon, casting eerie shapes upon the ground. It was the kind of night where the line between the living and the dead blurred, and for Alex, it was a night he would never forget. Alex was a journalist, always on the hunt for a good story. His latest assignment had brought him to Ravenswood, a place shrouded in mystery and fear. The villagers spoke in hushed tones of the abandoned mansion at the edge of the forest, a place they called Blackthorn Manor. It was said to be cursed, haunted by the ghost of a woman who had been wrong in life. Curiosity had always been Alex's driving force. The tales of the ghost Lady Eleanor intrigued him. The villagers warned him to stay away, their eyes wide with terror as they recounted the stories of those who had ventured into the manor and never returned. But Alex dismissed their warnings as mere superstition. He had faced many so-called haunted places before and had always emerged unscathed. The journey to Blackthorn Manor was treacherous. The forest seemed alive, its gnarled trees reaching out like skeletal hands. The air was heavy, and an unnatural silence blanketed the path. Alex's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of movement just beyond its beam. He chalked it up to his imagination and pressed on, his resolve unwavering. As he approached the manor, its looming silhouette emerged from the shadows. The structure was in a state of decay, its windows shattered and its walls covered in ivy. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rot. Alex felt a shiver run down his spine, but brushed it off as the chill of the night. Pushing open the creaking front door, Alex stepped inside. The interior was just as decrepit as the exterior, with broken furniture and cobwebs adorning every corner. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the halls. He set up his camera and recorder, determined to document everything. Hours passed as Alex explored the manor, finding little more than decay and emptiness. He began to doubt the villagers' tales, feeling a pang of disappointment. Just as he was about to call it a night, he heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. Leave, the voice said, chillingly soft, yet commanding. Titi. Alex's heart raced as he spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. There was no one there. He swallowed hard, convincing himself it was the wind playing tricks on him. But then the whisper came again, louder this time. You shouldn't be here. Adrenaline surged through Alex as he followed the sound, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The whisper led him to a grand staircase, its banister carved with intricate patterns. At the top stood a figure, barely visible in the dim light. She was clad in a tattered white dress, her long hair obscuring her face. Lady Eleanor, Alex called out, his voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. Instead, she turned and glided away, her movements unnaturally smooth. Against his better judgment, Alex followed her, climbing the staircase 2 steps at a time. He reached the top and found himself in a long clouds. The air was colder here, and his breath formed visible clouds. The figure disappeared into one of the rooms, and Alex hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. Inside was a bedroom, its furnishings covered in dust and cobwebs. A large mirror stood in the corner, its surface cracked and tarnished. The room was empty, but Alex could feel a presence, an oppressive weight that made his chest tighten. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind him and the temperature plummeted. Alex's flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as he fumbled for his phone, using its weak light to illuminate the room. That's when he saw her reflection in the mirror. Lady Eleanor stood behind him, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Alex turned to face her, but the room was empty. He looked back at the mirror, and she was still there, staring at him with an intensity that froze him in place. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice echoing in his mind. Alex struggled to find his voice. "Mm, I'm here to uncover the truth about you," he stammered. This time the crickets sang. Her expression shifted from sorrow to anger. "The truth?" she hissed. "You seek the truth, but you do not understand the cost." Before Alex could respond, the mirror shattered and a force slammed him against the wall. He gasped for air, his body pinned by an unseen power. Lady Eleanor's voice filled the room, growing louder and more menacing. And then the mirror turned. "You cannot undo what has been done. Leave this place and never return." The pressure released him, and Alex crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath. He scrambled to his feet and bolted from the room, his mind racing. He could hear footsteps behind him, relentless and unyielding. No matter how fast he ran, they grew closer. He burst out of the manor and into the forest, the cold night air biting at his skin. The footsteps ceased, but the sense of being watched lingered. Alex didn't stop running until he reached the village, collapsing on the steps of the inn where he was staying. The villagers found him the next morning, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. They didn't need to ask what had happened. They knew. Alex tried to warn them, to tell them that Lady Eleanor was more than a ghost story, but they shook their heads, their expressions filled with resignation. "You should have listened," an old man said. "Some truths are better left buried." Alex left Ravenswood the next day, but the experience stayed with him. He could still hear her voice in his dreams, warning him to stay away. Despite his terror, a part of him yearned to return, to uncover the full story of Lady Eleanor. But he knew better. Some doors once opened can never be closed. Before start second story, please do subscribe my YouTube channel and share it with your friends and family. Thanks. The House on Hawthorne Hill. In the small town of Cresville, nestled between dark forests and rolling hills, there stood a house abandoned. and desolate for years. The locals called it the Hawthorne House, and it was a place of whispered tales and deep-set fear. To most, the house was nothing more than an eyesore, a place to avoid, a broken structure that refused to yield to time. But for Clara, the house was an enigma, an invitation she couldn't ignore. Clara had always been curious. She was an artist, one who found beauty in decay, in things forgotten and left to wither. The Hawthorne house had always fascinated her, its crumbling exterior, the thick ivy creeping up its walls like an ancient, secretive entity. The windows, broken and clouded with age, seemed to watch her whenever she passed by like sentinels from another time. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara stood at the edge of the hill, staring at the house. Her pulse quickened as the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of old wood and earth. She had heard the rumored stories of people who had entered the house and never returned, stories of strange noises, shadows moving against the grain of light, and whispers that seemed to come from the very walls. But none of that mattered to Clara. The house called to her, a siren song she couldn't resist. That night, with a sketchbook tucked under her arm and a flashlight in hand, she made her way up the path leading to the Hawthorne house. The sky had darkened completely now, and the air grew colder with each step. As she approached the front door, she hesitated for only a moment. Her heart beat louder than the wind, but she pushed the fear aside and pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, the sound echoing in the silent air. The interior was dim, the only light coming from her flashlight, which flickered as if it were reluctant to be in such a place. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, the floorboards creaked beneath her feet, and the scent of mold and decay filled the air. But none of this deterred Clara. She took out her sketchbook and began to draw, capturing the twisted beauty of the place, its broken windows, the torn furniture, and the strange unsettledness that seemed to hang in the air. As she sketched, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. A cold breeze swept through the room, and the faintest sound of whispering reached her ears. It was indistinct at first, like a murmur in a language she couldn't understand. She froze, her hand hovering over a page. She strained to listen, but the whispers faded as quickly as they had come. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. Just the wind, she muttered to herself. But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Clara moved deeper into the house, her flashlight illuminating the dark corners. Each room she entered seemed more oppressive than the last, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When she reached the staircase, her heartbeat quickened. The stairs were steep, and the upper floor was swallowed in darkness. But Clara was undeterred. She had to see it all, capture the essence of the place in her art. She ascended the stairs, her footsteps heavy and echoing. The whispers were louder now, more distinct, like voices calling her name. Clara, heart racing, tried to ignore them, but they persisted. She reached the top of the stairs and hesitated before pushing open the door to a bedroom. The room was large, the bed covered in dust and old sheets, but what caught Clara's attention was the what beside the bed, a strange symbol. Like her eyes widened as she studied it, her mind racing. The symbol seemed familiar, as if she had seen it before in some forgotten dream. The whispers grew louder, now clearly saying her name. Clara, Clara. Her flashlight flickered again, and when it came back on, the room seemed different. The air felt heavier, and the shadows cast by her light danced unnaturally, shifting in ways they shouldn't. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and she spun around, her breath quickening. Suddenly the room grew cold, impossibly cold. Clara's breath misted in the air, and she could see her own pulse in the silence. She tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic gripped her chest as the whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a storm. The bed creaked, and Clara's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward it. The sheets moved as though something was beneath them, and then, to her horror, the figure of a woman emerged, pale, gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark. The woman was smiling, but it was a smile of pure malice, a grin that spread unnaturally wide. Clara stepped back, her breath shallow. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. She simply reached out, her long, bony fingers extending toward Clara's neck. The air seemed to grow thicker, suffocating. Clara screamed, her hand reaching for the doorknob again, but it remained firmly locked. Her pulse pounded in her ears as the woman stepped closer, her face now inches from Clara's. The whispers were deafening voices in a chorus of agony, their words unintelligible but full of suffering. "Leave, leave this place," the woman finally whispered, her voice rasping like dry leaves. "You should never have come." Clara's eyes were wide with terror. She shoved against the door with all her strength, and this time it gave way. The door swung open and she stumbled backward into the hallway, gasping for breath. She didn't stop running until she was outside, the cold night air rushing over her like a wave. The house loomed behind her, dark and silent once more, but Clara knew something had changed. She could feel it deep in her bones. The house had claimed a piece of her, just as it had claimed those before her. She never returned to the Hawthorne house, and she never spoke of what happened that night. But her art, once full of life and light, took on a darker tone. Her sketches became haunted, twisted images of shadows and broken forms. And sometimes, when the wind howled through the trees, she could hear the whispers again, calling her name. The silent reflection. Evelyn had always been a believer in the rational. A scientist by training, she thrived in the world of facts and figures where nothing existed without explanation. Her life was orderly, predictable, and driven by logic. She had no room for superstition or fantasy, even though the town she lived in, Dunbridge, was known for its oddities. Strange stories were told in hushed voices, but Evelyn never gave them a second thought. That was until she inherited the old mansion. The house, tucked away on the edge of Dunbridge, had been in her family for generations. Evelyn had never visited it in her youth, and after her parents' sudden passing, it became hers by default. The estate, massive and decaying, stood on a hill that overlooked the town like a silent sentinel. It had been abandoned for years, but Evelyn felt it was her duty to restore it, if only to preserve the family legacy. She arrived one crisp autumn evening, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. The house loomed before her, its windows like vacant eyes. As she stepped onto the front porch, the door creaked open as if it had been waiting for her. There was a chill in the air, and the wind carried with it a faint, almost imperceptible hum, a sound that seemed to come from within the walls. Evelyn shook it off, attributing it to the age of the house and her own growing apprehension. Inside, the house was exactly as she imagined it, dusty, forgotten, and filled with memories of a time long past. The furniture was draped in white sheets, and cobwebs hung like tapestries in the corners. The floorboards groaned under her weight, and the air smelled of mothballs and mildew. It was clear the house had been abandoned for much longer than she expected, but Evelyn was determined to make it her home. She spent the next few days cleaning and inspecting the rooms, slowly beginning to restore the mansion to its former glory. But as she worked, strange things began to happen. Doors would close behind her with no explanation, and objects were moved from where she had placed them. At first, she chalked it up to her own forgetfulness or the house settling, but the occurrences became more frequent and harder to ignore. One evening, as she wandered through the house, a glimmer in the parlor caught her eye. A large ornate mirror stood against the far wall, its frame intricately carved with patterns she didn't recognize. The mirror, despite the dust and age, seemed almost pristine, as if it were calling to her. She walked closer, drawn to it, and gazed into her own reflection. For a moment nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Her face stared back at her, pale, tired from the work, but unmistakably her own. But as she studied the reflection, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the mirror, her reflection smiled, but she hadn't moved her lips. Frozen, Evelyn's gaze remained locked on the glass. Her reflection began to shift subtly, its eyes moving independently of hers, darting toward the corners of the room, as though something else was present. She stepped back, her heart pounding, and the reflection followed her, still smiling unnervingly. It was as if the mirror had come alive with a consciousness of its own, one that had been lying dormant for years, waiting for her to arrive. Her breath quickened, and she turned away from the mirror, trying to dismiss the vision as a trick of the light or fatigue. But deep down, a cold fear had begun to gnaw at her. She didn't believe in the supernatural, but there was something about that smile, that presence in the reflection, that she couldn't shake. That night, Evelyn tossed and turned in bed, the sound of wind howling through the trees outside rattling the windows. Her mind kept returning to the mirror, and she couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to the house, something hidden in its history that she didn't know. She had no answers, but one thing was certain, the mirror was not normal. The next day, despite her doubts, Evelyn decided to investigate. She researched the mansion's history, digging through old records in the town archives. What she uncovered made her skin crawl. The house had once belonged to an eccentric relative, a woman named Isolde Ashford, known for her obsession with the occult. Isolde had been fascinated with mirrors, believing them to be portals to other realms, and she had collected them throughout her life. Some of her more bizarre experiments were said to have taken place in the very parlor where the mirror stood. Evelyn felt a chill crawl down her spine as she read further. According to the documents, Isolde had vanished under mysterious circumstances, and her disappearance was never solved. Her relatives claimed she had been lost to the reflection, whatever that meant. The final note in the records was a warning: beware the mirrors, they take more than they give. The words echoed in Evelyn's mind, and she rushed back to the mansion, her footsteps quick with urgency. She entered the parlor, her eyes immediately drawn to the mirror. This time the reflection wasn't just smiling, it was staring at her with an intensity that felt like it was reaching out, like it was aware of her presence. She approached it, her pulse pounding in her throat. The reflection didn't move this time, but Evelyn noticed something even more disturbing. The figure in the glass seemed to be waiting. Slowly, almost hesitantly, she reached out to touch the cold surface of the mirror. The instant her fingers brushed against it, the temperature in the room dropped, and the world around her seemed to blur. Suddenly, the reflection in the mirror shifted. The smile vanished, and the figure's eyes, now dark, hollow, locked onto hers. Evelyn tried to pull her hand back, but it was as if the mirror had a grip on her, pulling her in. She gasped, struggling to free herself, but the pull grew stronger, like an invisible force was drawing her closer. The room around her began to warp, the walls stretching and twisting, and Evelyn felt herself being sucked toward the mirror. She screamed, her voice echoing, but it was drowned out by a chorus of whispers, low, guttural, and unintelligible. Panic set in as she fought to break free, but the mirror had become a living thing, its surface rippling like water. And then, in one violent motion, Evelyn was yanked into the mirror. Everything went black. When she awoke, it was as though she had been submerged in darkness for an eternity. She found herself standing in the parlor again, but something was horribly wrong. The room was distorted, warped in ways she couldn't comprehend. The furniture was disfigured, the walls pulsated with a sickly glow, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. In the reflection of the mirror, Evelyn saw herself once more, but she was no longer the same. Her skin was pale, her eyes hollow, and the smile on her face was twisted, distorted, far too wide. Her reflection wasn't just mimicking her, it had become her. She was the one trapped behind the glass now. As the realization hit her, the whispers began again, louder this time, reverberating through her skull. You should have left. You should have never come. Evelyn's heart thundered in her chest, but it was too late. She reached out to the mirror, her fingers pressed against its cold surface, but it was useless. The reflection of her hand in the glass remained out of reach. The mirror had claimed her, and now she was trapped in a world of silence and darkness, with only her reflection for company. And as the last of her consciousness faded, one final thought crossed her mind. The house had not been waiting for her. It had been waiting for the right reflection. Thanks for watching, and please do subscribe for more interesting stories.